that you have an assignment for next week, right? Where you're kind of coming up with your own behavioral research topic. It can be in any genre, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be in auditing. But the idea is that you use the Libby boxes in the Kennedy 3 paragraphs to kind of come up with an interesting topic, right? So for the remaining part of this particular class, I'm going to help you with that, right? And I'm supposed to tell you guys that obviously it's a smaller group than we thought. You're going to work in groups of 2 instead of 3, right? So unfortunately, if you've started, we'll break that up a little bit. But the idea is just because we're going to have some sort of discussion next week, right? And it'll be easier if we have more things to talk about instead of just 3. I think it would have 3 or 4. We would have did that. And I'm supposed to tell you that we need to update that to 2.
She told me how to.
Okay. Good. He's already done it. That's awesome. So this is kind of the practical application half of the class, right? You can call me Helen number 2 if you like. So all the things that Dr. Brown-LaBird had talked about in the beginning of this particular class.
There are 7 in class.
Are there 7?
Yeah.
I never did that. Oh. That's going to be interesting. Well, do you have a volunteer to come up with an idea by themselves? Boldness. Go for it. You know you want it. I'll give you to them for class. Yeah, somebody's going to have to work by themselves. Unless you want me to do it, and I'm not that good of a group builder. Yeah, I guess one person's going to... Because as we discuss the particular project, it might become easier that it's not so difficult. It might be even easier to work by yourself than in a group for this one. So we'll resolve it by the end of the course class. So Helen went over a number of different kind of psychological or behavioral aspects to auditing research, the impacts on the accounting profession, right, capital markets, and then also what that means in terms of incorporating technology into that aspect, right? So what we're going to do, we're going to talk amongst ourselves about what that means in terms of these questions, and there was a suggested reading for today. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you over it, but we're going to kind of explore that. So if some of you guys don't have topics already, for tomorrow, next week, we'll actually kind of come up with some. Yep. All right. So if you haven't already, this little PowerPoint presentation or whatever, we're not going to go over it today, but use this as your guide in terms of getting the ideas from the Libby boxes and how to kind of come up with operationalizing different ideas and variables in behavioral research, and then put it in terms of the 3 Kinney paragraphs. If you have any questions about that, this is the part of the class where you can come kind of talk about it as we go on a little bit. So some of the 4 questions that we're going to actually start discussing in a second when I stop talking is what data analytic tools can be used to aid auditors in performing judgments, all right? What sort of audit tasks can be aided by data analytic tools? Can technology be effective in eliminating or mitigating certain judgment decision-making processes? And then are there any barriers to using more advanced data analytics by auditors, right? So keep these ideas in mind as we start to talk about kind of behavioral research, right? So the suggested reading that I'm probably going to work from for the majority part of this class is from How Insights from New JDM Research Can Improve Auditor Judgment and Fundamental Research Questions and Methodologies and Advice, right? Hint, hint, that's where you go for advice on coming up with your questions for next week, right? So kind of the main focus of this particular this particular article is around kind of two different ways of thinking about JDM, or judgment decision making research. One is that humans have this dual process model in terms of how we think, right? There's type 1 and there's type 2. If you're familiar with psychology, behavioral research, or just kind of system 1 and system 2 thinking in general, Kahneman and Tversky, basically one type of thinking is instinctual, right? It's the first level. It's the one in which we have the most, we use the most heuristics, right? Helen was talking about heuristics as rules of thumb. They're kind of things that in psychology we would say that that's how they, how people use stereotypes to engage in fast thinking, right? Type 2 or system 2 thinking is more engaged. It's more thoughtful, right? And then the authors of the article also talks about conscious and non-conscious goals, right? Next week we'll talk about motivated reasoning, and that's one thing. That's one of the theories that I used in my particular dissertation, and it kind of gets at outcome versus process goals, or in a sense, conscious versus non-conscious goals, right? So we're kind of going to explore that particular framework when it comes to thinking about these particular questions, right? So when you guys are coming up with your ideas for next week in terms of kind of where to go with this particular assignment, you know, you can pick anything under the sun, but if you need some guidance in terms of JDM research, start to think about something that Helen had mentioned earlier today. I let her take the clicker because I was like, no, I'm not going to use it. Whatever. These particular heuristic or bias traps, we didn't go into a lot of detail about them because we will go into detail about them next week, right? But if you think about some of the traps that people in general go through, you can see how that can apply to behavioral research, specifically in auditing, and what auditors may fall prey to when they're doing or engaging in system 1 thinking, right? So in my particular dissertation, when I talked about conscious versus non-conscious goals, the premise behind my dissertation was that I wanted to see if we can encourage auditors to engage in that deeper thinking, in that system 2 thinking, instead of the system 1, right? Are there certain ways that we can actually encourage that from auditors? Because the PCAOB was finding all sorts of issues with, as Helen mentioned before, that auditors were not supporting their opinions properly, right? The work papers and the actual information that they were gathering in their actual audits were not sufficient. So I was thinking, when I was coming up with the research idea, well, what would make an auditor do that, right? Auditors have been trained, right, by universities and by their particular audit firms. So how is it that they were failing to do some of what I would consider these basic things, right? You collect sufficient evidence. Everybody knows that. So one of the ways that I explored that was with the motivated reasoning theory, right? Maybe there's some sort of unconscious bias or unconscious bias that they're actually susceptible to. So I argued, not very well, I don't think, but I argued that maybe the standard itself, the integrated auditing standard, AIS number 5, was unconsciously giving auditors an outcome focus, right? If we have to use this particular testing that we gather in our internal controls testing, to use that to formulate our testing for substantive procedures in the financial statement audit, maybe due to some other pressures like budgeting pressures, maybe client-auditor relationships, other things that I mentioned in my dissertation, maybe that would cause the auditor to have an outcome focus, right? And that outcome focus is having a standard audit, let's just put it like that. And so maybe they started to engage in information-seeking behaviors, right? So they started to anchor, right? Or fall into this conformatory information trap where they have these held beliefs, right? I think that, based on prior experience, based on my relationship with the client, I think that they're, in essence, they had a good audit last year, they're gonna have another good one this year. So maybe when I see numbers or I go through analytical procedures that have a lot of subjectivity, or I'm looking at internal control deficiencies, that I'm not likely to actually upgrade those to material weaknesses, right? Because there's judgment involved in that. And so does this outcome focus weaken the auditor's judgment on an unconscious level? Obviously, they wouldn't consciously do that. Again, they've been trained not to. So I mention all that because there are different levels to behavioral research, right? It's not black and white. It involves judgment as well. And we draw a lot on the psychological literature. So what we're going to do today is kind of explore some of the questions that this particular article raises, and kind of go back and answer these questions in a more IT focus. So this is the part where you actually have to wake up. I'm just putting it out there. It's gonna happen. I'm gonna pick on you in a loving way, but I'm gonna pick on you, right? So, like I said, that how insights from new JVM research can improve auditor judgment, some fundamental research questions. What we're gonna do is kind of break down some of these questions and see if we can come up with better or more specific ways that we can apply this to behavioral research. Of course, this is an auditing setting, but next week when you actually do your particular assignments, it doesn't necessarily have to be audited, right? So, Helen mentioned dual process framework. Again, that's that type 1 versus type 2 thinking, right? So kind of give yourself a frame of reference. What we're talking about here is the instinctual thinking, right? Almost stereotypical, versus a more thoughtful, kind of deeper engaged thinking, right? More active, which research suggests that when you engage in the system 2, you're likely to have more accurate judgments, versus when you engage in system 1, right? You're more susceptible to these biases, conscious biases as well. So, type 1, type 2, dual process framework, right? So the first question is what prior knowledge, right, and beliefs. So for instance, if you're an auditor in an auditing setting, right, in my dissertation, maybe you performed an internal control audit first, and you have all these preconceived notions about what the internal control structure looks like. Now you have to go into the financial statement audit and do some standard procedures regarding that, right? Or, let's see, what prior knowledge and beliefs are likely to impair the decision quality due to undesirable type 1 responses, right? So instinctual responses. Whenever I think about type 1 and type 2, in the type 1 situation, right, imagine that a guy or girl is running at you down the street with a gun in their hand, right? So my heuristics, based on my prior beliefs and my type 1 thinking, is to either A, run and hide, or if I'm feeling more of a flight or fight type situation, maybe I'll trip because maybe somebody's running after me. I don't know, right? But stereotypically, if somebody's running at you with a gun, you know what you're gonna do, right? That's more of a systematic response, right? System 2, if you engage in deeper thinking, maybe you realize that instead of that quick instinctual, quick response, like the KPMG judgment framework engages us to do, think of alternatives, but not in that situation, just run. Maybe that person running down the street was actually a police officer, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean danger in that situation. Of course, that's an extreme example, because either way, I'm probably gonna get out of the way. I'm not gonna lie. But it lets you know that we engage in those stereotypical responses to certain stimuli because it helps us to make a quick decision. That quick decision doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad decision, right? Like I said, either way, I'm going to get out the way. But in system 1, it meant danger, and I just instinctually would act. But in system 2, it doesn't necessarily mean danger, right? So as an auditor, when we're in an auditing setting, and you see like something like an internal control deficiency, right? Means there might be an error in the internal controls. They're not functioning as they should, right? Does that mean that the entire financial statement, the system, none of that is reliable? It doesn't necessarily mean that, right? It takes other, like a more thoughtful evaluation of the entire internal control structure before you can make a decision like that, right? We need to engage in that system 2 thinking, all right? So, for questions like what sort of prior knowledge and beliefs are likely to impair decision quality due to system 1 thinking, what do you guys think? So, as an auditor, what sort of things can cause you, what sort of prior beliefs or knowledge can cause you to want to engage in that system 1 thinking, that instinctual thinking? What do you think? So I'm going to call on Edward because he's thinking very thoughtfully. All right? So think about it, Edward. If you're an auditor, right?
Yeah.
And you audited this particular client last year, right? What sort of things can make you engage in system 1 thinking versus system 2?
If the business process is routine,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, comment always usually happen.
Yeah.
That's system 1 thinking.
So, thank you, Bill. So, if you audited that client last year, and it's pretty routine, and you've audited them before, and you're thinking to yourself, maybe consciously, right, that their processes are pretty routine, right? I used to audit manufacturing way back then, right? And whenever we were doing inventory, you know, if you knew the processes of manufacturing, they're pretty routine, right? Procurement, production, selling, it's pretty routine. And so maybe, because I had that knowledge, I could have been engaging in system 1 thinking, right? I may have a stereotype of what I think that process is going to look like, right? And so that could cause, what could be some problems with that particular scenario? What could be some issues as an auditor that could come up if I'm used to a certain client? What do you think? What could be some problems that could come up, Selena? All right.
The firm could be like wrong or trying to deceive you.
Ah. So what if this client that I've held so dear for like the past 5 years has been engaging in fraud? I would hope that never happens. But we talked earlier with Helen about trust and things like that, right? I can't remember which slide it was on. But in behavioral research, there's a lot of literature about professional skepticism and things like that. One thing that you might want to consider whenever you are coming up with topics is that there can be different levels of trust or levels of skepticism. For instance, a certain situation, like let's take Selena's example, but kind of reverse it a little bit. What if, hypothetical, what if Enron still existed, okay? And you were the audit team assigned to audit Enron. That situation in and of itself may heighten your skepticism, right? That situational skepticism. However, I happen to be something that I would call a dispositional skeptic, right? It's just my nature, right? Whenever I did auditing, whether it was internal or external, I would often find, I won't say fraud, but let's just say questionable items, you know? Because I'm dispositionally skeptical, right? Professionally skeptical, I'm not gonna say it. I'm skeptical of you guys. right? So when you think about things like that, both of those situations, the situation that Selena had come up with and what Edward had told us earlier, kind of can spawn different ideas that you might have for next week when you come up with topics, right? Because we're using behavioral theories to kind of explore auditing or accounting phenomena, right? So let's do another one. So let's talk about some audit tasks that could possibly engage us to use type 2 thinking, right? What are some audit, I'll move over there again, what are some audit tasks that could possibly engage us to want to engage in that type 2 or more systematic thinking?
I think some business have high volatility. I mean, fluctuated very much. That's type 2 thinking.
So whenever there's not necessarily consistency in the client's market, right? There might be volatility in the market or sales in general or just any type of volatility. That's a good one, right? Remember earlier we were starting to talk about estimates, right? Fair value. Anytime there's high complexity or ambiguity, it could lead us to, well, there's differing research on this task, right? As we talked about earlier in this class, sometimes if it's too ambiguous, we may revert to using that system 1, right? However, there is some research that suggests that there are certain tasks that would allow us to engage that system 2, right? In terms of, and this kind of crosses into the goals, but in terms of motivated reasoning, right? We engage in these kind of biased thinking. However, if the task is too extreme, it kind of negates that particular theory. So when you're thinking of ideas, right, for next week in terms of behavioral research, you can kind of explore that, right? What are some tasks that you think might cause the auditor or accountant, depending on what your topic is, to engage in system 1 thinking versus system 2? Let's see. Let's talk about conscious and unconscious goals, because I'm biased, right? We're talking about biases. I'm biased because my dissertation was in conscious and unconscious goals and internal controls, so I'm biased. If you've taken, well, nobody's in this class has taken my audit class, but if you've taken Helen's audit class, you did the KPMG judgment framework, you've gone through the 5 steps, you would know that there are certain biases that we do unconsciously, basically. But if you do them unconsciously, how can you avoid them? Well, the best way to avoid or to mitigate them actually is to be aware of them. So we're going to talk about conscious and unconscious goals. So one of the research questions was what goals in conscious or unconscious, non-conscious, are auditors pursuing? And then which of these goals improve audit quality and which detract from it? So what's nice about these research questions is that there's a lot of ambiguity with them. And that was kind of what the authors had in mind in terms of the framework. It kind of inspires you to think, okay, let's be more specific, right? And any of these could be plausible research ideas that do need to be explored. That's kind of nice, right? So you might come up with some publishable ideas out of this little exercise, which is obviously the goal. All right, so imagine that we may be aware of different goals, right? You may have a goal to be accurate, right? Focus on the process to make sure that you're performing the audit within established guidelines and rules, right? Or you may be susceptible to some unconscious biases or goals. that you weren't aware of. Like I explored in my dissertation, unconscious, outcome-related goals. So what we're talking about here is think for a little bit about the fact that some goals, whether conscious or not, can help audit quality while others can hurt it. Okay? So let's think about some of the ways that having goals, whether conscious or not, can hurt audit quality. What are some ways that having goals can hinder audit quality? I'm not calling it. Who have enough? What was your name again? I'm going to be doing this the whole entire time. It's fantastic. Yes.
Joey.
Go ahead.
Joey.
Joey.
Yeah.
All right. So, Joey,
Yeah.
what if, I have been working on an audit for 4 years, right? Same client. I'm from St. Louis, so we'll say Anheuser-Busch, your client. All right? So the people I go to get information for the audit, maybe the person I go to gather all these invoices because I'm antiquated and I don't get them on the system. We've got a good rapport with that particular person, right? So we've got this auditor-client relationship. It's not a violation of independence, we're not that far, but we've got this kind of good rapport. How would that, and say in this particular situation, maybe my goal is to keep that rapport, right? Or even on some audit clients, you don't want to hinder that relationship. We want to continue that business, right? So how would that possibly hurt auditor quality?
So you want to maintain your relationship?
Yeah.
So it's not independent, right? Because you say you want to find the auditor to get some information privately.
So in this particular situation, we have this audit client, right?
Yeah.
And we need to gather, we need to do our substantive tests every year. Right?
Yeah.
We go get information. And because you've been going to the same person year after year, right? You know that if you go to Selena, she's going to get it to you really fast, really quick. You can stay within your time budgets, make your partners happy. However, you've seen other people in your audit team interact with her, and she doesn't like them, right? So she waits a whole week before she gives them information. How could that be that situation would be problematic towards auditor quality? And I think you were about to say it.
Yeah, I think the auditor, because you have a good relationship, sometimes the auditor will bias and you say not profession and will give some benefit or meet some problems.
Absolutely, right? Remember, we're talking about judgments here, right?
Yeah.
And so when we're making recommendations to the client to make adjustments, that's kind of a negotiation, right? Maybe we're unconsciously hindered by wanting to maintain a relationship with a certain person. Or, on the flip end, has anybody been an auditor before? You ever? Just you? We have these things called time budgets in auditing, right? Time budgets. So the partners and people way above us have negotiated these contracts, right? And their audit fees based on it should take us approximately this many hours to complete an audit, this many weeks, this is how much we're going to charge you. If some unexpected event, comes up, we may go over, that's not our fault, but typically we stay within this budget, right? And so as a result of that, each cycle is awarded a certain amount of hours, right? And guess what? As us seniors and first level auditing staff, we're told what that budget is and we're measured accordingly, right? So if last year, and usually the metric is based on how long it took us to do it last year and all that good stuff. So if last year it took 4 hours to complete the cash cycle, guess what? You have 4 hours on your budget, right? Now, you get promoted as an auditor based on your efficiency, your productivity, how many billable hours you get. Well, if you go over 4 hours on that cash cycle, that hurts your productivity, your efficiency score, right? So now you have this pressure, right, to stay within your time budget, your allotted time, all right? Could that possibly create some sort of conscious or unconscious goal? There's some pressure there. There's plenty of research on how time budgets may affect performance, right? Maybe I'm more likely to skip over some of those weaker deficiencies, which are actually not that weak, right? But it's interesting to explore how these goals may hurt or hinder audit quality. Because maybe for some of you, having that extra time pressure makes you more efficient. Maybe it doesn't necessarily hinder the way that you do your audit, right? Maybe you start to be more innovative and develop more analytical tools or data analytical tools that would help you be more efficient. It could spawn innovation, right? So it's not necessarily bad. But my system one thinking would tell me that, it might be, right? So those are just another, so having goals could detract or improve quality, right? It's possible. So there's so many on here. How do competing goals affect auditors' judgment decision-making quality? Right? So we have competing goals, right? Which you do as an auditor, right? You do have competing goals. On one hand, you need to be as accurate as possible. We perform reasonable assurance as an auditors, right? I have a problem saying we, like I still audit. So auditors perform risk-based audits, which by definition are reasonable assurance audits, not absolute assurance. Even though, as data analytics can suggest, we could possibly be moving towards more absolute assurance. Never absolute, but moving towards it, right? So you have this idea that there's only a certain amount of time you complete the audit, like a limited resource, right? A certain amount of cost that within the budget. So you have these constraints that tells you that you need to be extremely quick when you perform. But you also need to be accurate, and those are competing, right? So as in research, we want to explore how does those competing goals actually impact judgment decision-making quality? Does it make us more susceptible to biases? Probably. As a behavioralist, I'm going to say yes. Because we have those limited resources, and it's kind of causing us to be a little quick in terms of how we look at deficiencies and internal controls, or we look at problems in general. Yeah. So there's probably 8 research questions in each one of those arenas, whether it's the conscious or unconscious goals or the dual purpose framework. So when you're thinking about behavioral ideas and you maybe haven't come up with one, I would definitely explore that. Because even when I'm coming up with research topics, or I'm kind of altering my dissertation and splitting it up, I still think about how I could operationalize some of the variables in those particular topics, right? So now we're going to talk about kind of exploring this specific discussion that we left off in the slide deck. And I'm trying to think. Before we do that, are there any questions about what you have to do or what you're expected to do for next week? You can ask. All right. general knowledge, like, how many of you guys are interested in AIS research? Like, just if you were going to do a research project or you're involved with one right now, that's probably your area. What are you interested in?
Behavioral finance.
Finance?
Yeah.
Really? Tell us more about them. Behavioral finance. I like that. Whenever I hear about something like behavioral finance and or behavioral tax, I'm always like, how do you do that? But that's the same thing people say when I say auditing. Like, really? What are you interested in? Corporate finance and the trading strategy. So, when you talk about strategy, do you include like negotiation? Like the interpersonal, like the actual, are you more of a capital markets type of? When I received my MBA, in our negotiations class, they brought in the guy who like supplied windows to Donald Trump, right? And I thought it was like the weirdest thing to hear him talk about how he negotiates. And I'm like, oh, that's so sweet. Like, a long time ago. So what are you interested in? If anything, it's okay if you say nothing. Corporate governance and capital markets. Keep that in mind. Selena, what about you?
I'm doing something with shareholder activism, so also like corporate governance.
Let's see how I can incorporate that in the remainder of the class. So the ones who said that they do AI or are potentially interested in AIS research, like any internal control interest or no? Randy, what are you interested in?
Currently, I'm working on the visualization project.
Got it. I think I'm supposed to get something from you actually.
Sandbox.
It's somewhere. Same.
Sandbox.
Oh yeah, the same box. I remember that. And you pretty much are interested in everything. So, moving on. All right, so let's talk about data analytics for a while. Who did you guys have before Hussein? Who came in? What did they talk about?
Text mining?
Text mining. So we did exceptional exceptions, text mining. What else? Machine learning. Helen talked about expertise, not mine. I could talk about internal controls and like heuristics and biases all day long because I'm interested in how people like make judgments, right? And engage in decision making, and I apply that in an auditor context. Right? And so that's why there's such a psychological base to it. So if we're in if I give you a frame of reference, we're talking about data analytics, right? And just to go back to something Helen was talking about earlier, when we talk about judgment versus decision making, right? You understand that making a decision is choosing between alternatives, right? But the judgment involves discrimination, right? It involves actively engaging the thought of exploring the different alternatives and weighing the options, and it's more involved. So it involves that level of discrimination, right? So when we're talking about that in a data analytic context, what sort of tools do you think can be used to aid auditors in performing judgment and decision-making tasks, all right? So here we're talking about, remember, the level of all the different estimates in accounting and the different judgments that auditors have to make. Now we're going to think about those tools that can help them, right? That can assist them. We didn't really talk about decision aids a lot, but what Helen did mention was kind of key in the research, is that decision aids should aid the auditor. However, reliance on like just checklist auditing limits that type 2 thinking, that systematic thinking, right? Instead, you're just checking off a checklist. And another topic I tried to explore in my dissertation is trying to get auditors to encourage those system 2 thinking, right? Instead of performing substantive tests that just kind of check off assertion, right? It takes this assertion. I tried to get them to explain or at least indicate why they were performing that test. Why are you making this decision, right? There's a bunch of research to support that if you can get them to kind of engage in the purpose, that would encourage those system 2 thinking, and the judgments are likely to be more accurate, right? So here when we're talking about data analytic tools, what can be helpful to the auditor when making decisions? Right? What do you think? So if we break this down into a kind of basic level, right? Auditors need to decide what's important and what's not, right? What's central or material and what's not. In what ways can data analytics kind of assist us with that? There are no bad answers. Go ahead.
Like the visualization software
Mm-hmm.
can help the auditor to find outlier, to find the cluster, to find the correlations.
That is pretty important, right? And we're talking about in general, even on a basic level. So we're talking about visualization, right? Back when I was an internal auditor, we used to use flowcharts to kind of understand the company's process, right? So we understood how certain systems flowed into another one, or certain processes affected another one in a pictorial form. It let us understand, okay, we understand how it should be working, so now we can identify places where it might not, right? Like here, when the information's going from one system to another, maybe that's a weakness. So in that case, specifically a flowchart was a visualization tool that would help us to make judgments about what task we were going to perform. For me it was helpful, but there could be there's a lot of potential for exploring how visualization actually assists, helps, or even affects auditors' decision making. Does it? Should audit firms be using it more? Are there specific places in the audit where it would be the most beneficial as compared to others? Right? What sort of, can it help us, specifically visualization, can it help us mitigate certain biases, right, that we talked about before? For instance, rush to solve. Maybe it can, visualization can actually help us to identify different alternatives, so we're not rushing to solve. We are presented instantaneously with different alternatives, right? What are some other data analytic tools that could be used? Go ahead, Ed.
Well, for the decision making,
Mm-hmm.
avoiding biases is very important. Yeah, and so I'm fascinated with machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
And in this this methodology is data driven, and it can avoid some biases. Like AlphaGo is perfect to work on well.
So what are some of the biases again? I'm sorry, that it could possibly.
Because machine learning is data driven.
Yes.
Yeah, and it can it just illustrate what data is, and explore what the pattern is. So it can help you avoid your mental biases.
Yes. So Professor Ailes and what Dr. Brown-Laberde mentioned earlier about recognition of patterns, right? So we have machine learning, right? Now we can explore this idea of having this enormous amount of data, right? and not having the issue of having human eyes constantly trying to find patterns or associations or relationships that might be central to audits, right? That might be extremely important in terms of analytical procedures that need to be performed. But in a machine learning context, that could be a tool that can use to aid decision making and judgment. What else?
SAS.
What's up?
SAS.
SAS?
Because it has a different part. I remember it has enterprise, right? Or other different, but I never used it because I never did an auditing job. But I guess the software is quite helpful.
So you're seeing that using software like SAS to kind of analyze and do different.
Yeah, it has different functions, much better than Excel.
That's arguable, but but yes, using a tool like that or some sort of analytics, some sort of a way that we can take this data and make it useful, right? In general, yes, absolutely. Not a good SAS coder, but it's kind of an inevitability in my line of work. Right? I also used R. Yeah, a lot when I was getting my PhD because, side note, I took a class where we had to non-linearly map the neural networks in your brain, first semester, and that professor used R, so we used R. What else can be some tools that we could possibly use to aid auditors in performing judgments? These are all really good, right? And hopefully they're spawning and thinking about, if not just one, but multiple different research ideas that can come from this, even for you behavioral finance, corporate governance type researchers. What could data analytics do to kind of aid in those genres? So taking it out of the auditing context, but putting it into a corporate governance, right? There's still going to be decisions that need to be made, right? Here, question number 2 is kind of getting at, so how does this change audit tasks or, financial or corporate governance tasks? Like, if these tools are developed, what does that mean? What could it mean? Is it going to help us to engage in more accurate thinking? Is it going to give us, so in my dissertation what I argued was that AIS number 5 gave auditors encourage auditors to have an outcome focused goal, which was a bad thing, right? Because we're going to engage in information seeking behaviors. We're going to have confirmation biases. We're going to have situations in which we decide to focus on information that supports our idea and disconfirm or discount information that doesn't, right? We shouldn't do that. As auditors, they're supposed to be objective. So, how can data analytic tools affect tasks? We won't just say auditing, because next week when we talk about research ideas, behavioral ideas, you guys are able to use any sort of topic that you want. It doesn't have to be audit. So?
Finance is okay?
What's that?
Finance is okay?
Yeah, it's finance is okay. I said no. No, but seriously, yeah, absolutely. I don't know much about finance. Other than, obviously, you have to take certain courses.
Just for fun.
What's that?
No problem, just for fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell that to my MBA professor. This is just for fun. Why are you making me learn this? So in the sense that we talk about data analytic tools, right? And maybe you have a preconceived notion of what that is, but I don't, right? Data analytic tools can be a number of things, right? It could be something we discussed in this class, or it could just be something that, I think of it as a process, right? I'm one of those people who always tries to think outside of the norm on purpose, just to see if it makes it more interesting. So when I first heard about the visualization project, right? and some of the other projects that were going on in the car lab, sandbox and radar and things like that, I thought that they all like felt like they were connected. You know what I mean? So it's like, obviously, you know, you got exceptional exceptions of process mining or text mining, and visualization, and I just kind of saw this kind of natural thread, but it's about the way that you interpret things, right? And you don't always have to think of them in the way that they're presented. Be chaotic, right? So we'll come back to exploring the different tasks, because it can be anything, actually. For instance, we're talking about decision making. I think on you just a little bit. And we're talking about a finance context. What are some of the, and this is open to everybody, what are some of the different decision making tasks that could occur in a behavioral finance setting, right? What are some of the decisions that have to be made? You know, whenever I answer people when they ask me how do you do research and auditing, specifically how do you do behavioral research, it's like, you take two different auditors and put them in the same situation, what makes one auditor make this decision versus another one make a different one, right? And then there's a human level to it, right? You put it in the auditing context, but for those people, you're actually taking it out. They're like, oh, just like, you know, why does one person choose blue versus red when they put on a shirt?
Just two people?
Yeah, I had to dumb it down for the elevator speech. Otherwise, you'd be talking to that person forever, and they're like, I was just asking. I didn't really want to know. But no, more than two people, obviously. In general, yes. Just a bunch of people. There's a whole entire population. But you have to define your population. We would definitely make it more than two. In a sense, can technology be effective in eliminating and mitigating common judgments and decision-making biases? What do you guys think about that one? There's a debate in research on whether or not we can eliminate auditors from auditing eventually. And some people think it's inevitable, right? That we can systematically develop, you know, machines that learn, technology, analytic tools that would kind of reduce the need for at least those lower level auditors, right? Because we can kind of make that systematic. But in general, do you think that technology can be effective in eliminating, or let's just talk about eliminating common judgment from decision-making process? Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree.
You do?
Yeah.
Why?
Like artificial intelligence
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the future, in the highly automatic audit environment, I think with less human being involved, the bias could be eliminated. Few songs.
Yeah, so Randy says if you think about it, think about all the different transactions, right, that happen within certain corporations or companies, right? These transactions are happening on a systematic level, right? They're going through different systems, they're going through different processes, and it's feasible to believe that auditing can kind of capture that, right? And make that part automatic in terms of doing analytic procedures, gathering that if you can build into a program to be able to look for certain, what are those things called? Categories of information. I can't think of them. You can tell I'm not a systems person, but pieces of data, right? Timestamps or approvals within the system, then that aspect of auditing could be gone. I'm an old schooler. I don't necessarily think that could ever happen, but that's because I'm overconfident about my judgments, as you want to talk about the biases, right? I'm like, the machine can't do. Yeah, it can. So, what about you guys? Do you think that technology can be effective in eliminating common, notice common, not those complex ones, but common judgment and decision-making biases?
It's hard to say totally eliminating the biases because machine is machine.
Yeah.
Garbage in and garbage out. So
But
maybe
doesn't it like
we need some knowledge or expertise to guide how to use technology to help.
This is true, but once it's programmed in there, then what, right? Once somebody actually does those things and programs the appropriate level of skepticism or tolerance levels, could it be gone? You're like me, you're like, no, I just, it can't. I like it, I like the support. Appreciate that. What do you guys think? Maybe? Not a financial person, so I'm about to delve into an area I'm not very familiar with, right? So bear with me. So let's talk about changes in stock price, right? So could changes could data analytic tools reduce the need for stockbrokers? Yeah?
Already some guys use a machine to.
Right, they're already using these complex equations. Can we eliminate the need for stockbrokers on that basic common level, right? For people like me who just kind of don't want to get that sophisticated in the market, but we just kind of want to trade and see things happen. It's funny because I would say yes to that question, but I'm so against the whole auditing one, right? Biased. What about this one? Are there any barriers to the use of more advanced analytics by auditors?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, right?
Because you have to know what the information is, otherwise the data you have to analyze them.
Great.
Yeah, and so this needs some more advanced technical or skills, statistics or mathematics or some others. You couldn't say, okay, I have the data, but I must do something, right?
What does it mean?
Yeah.
We go back to the same problem we had
We have
before.
to dig some information from this data.
Yeah. Like if we just have data and we don't make it useful or relevant to some situation, it doesn't become information, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anything. So yeah, it does. There are barriers, like you just said, because we go back to the same problem we have with big data, right? It's just out there, right? If we don't have some sort of way to make it useful or relevant, then it doesn't mean much to anyone. It's not relevant to anything. That's a good one. Like, where do you think? What else? What are some other barriers to the use of more data analytics? I, for one, think it's going to be limited, obviously, by the people who develop them, right? It can't do what it's not designed to do, right? So, for instance, as people get more sophisticated with committing frauds, right? Other people have to get more sophisticated in coming up with advanced data analytics to catch those frauds, right? When I was an auditor way back when, I remember, long story short, there was a sales, what they call trade spin. So imagine there's mom and pop gas stations all over the country, right? And these, I'm simplifying the situation to not make it complicated, but these sales reps, if you will, would go into these mom and pop gas stations all over the country and write them rebate checks, maybe for coupons that they used or whatever the system was, right? And because these are like small mom and pop gas stations, they're not like 7-Elevens or anything like that. There wasn't a master vendor list, right? Long story short, let's just say one of these particular sales reps could possibly go into gas stations, say that they're writing checks for S&P, right, gas station, and then have a bank account for S.P gas station and write a check to S.P instead of S&P, right? Well, to the naked eye or to maybe one of my basic analytic tools, that would seem like a legitimate transaction. If I saw a check come through and it was written to S.P, I'm like, okay, they write them out, it's not a big deal. However, I would need to build a more advanced analytical tool to catch any sort of variations, right? Say they're writing checks to like 7-Eleven now. How do you necessarily, how is 7-Eleven spelled, right? Is it 7-11? Is it the numbers, is it the letters, things like that. Someone has to come up with that idea, right, that to build it into the analytical tool to catch that. And then at what point does it become very, does it hinder the process to be adding that many layers, right? Another side story, I worked for, I don't want to say his name, but I worked for a corporation that was global, right? And they had outsourced some of their accounts payable and accounts receivable to India, right? And I had to go to India and perform an audit there because invoices for light bills were being paid in the factories, right? So they'd submit the invoice for the utilities payment and it'd be kicked back down to start over, right? So say the wrong person signed on the wrong line, right? They were supposed to sign on line A, they signed on line B. Still has the right approval, right, for the bill, but because it was on line A, they had to take it all the way back through the process. And if someone didn't correct it, they would take it all the way back through the process, which is what should be happening, right? It's not according to the data analytical tools. However, if that process takes so long that the utilities get cut off, right, it's going to hinder operations. So at what point do the tools that we use actually hinder the process by adding more layers to it, right? There was nothing built into this particular, I don't want to say it's a data analytic tool, but it kind of was. This particular tool to kind of help incorporate the time aspect, the importancy, right? But you can build that in there, but somebody has to think about it. So when we're talking about barriers to the use of advanced data analytics by auditors, it kind of could be any barrier, right? It could be something as basic as the fallacies of the person building or using the tool or building the tool, right? It could be that maybe even the software is not as advanced as it needs to be. Somebody needs to build that before we can start adding on that. So these ideas were in a more kind of data analytics context. But going back to auditor judgment and behavior, because that's what today's we can still, when we talk about your assignment for next week and coming up with ideas, for those of you who are doing auditor judgment, for those of you who decide that they want to explore something else, why not? We can use it to kind of help each other build the ideas. When I think about judgment decision-making research, I didn't learn about JDM in accounting. When I first took my first JDM class, it was in psychology, right? So I really had the opportunity to apply it to different aspects, right? I had marketing students in my class, I had psychology students, so we didn't always think in terms of the same genre, right? They weren't always thinking auditing whenever they saw the teacher present something, right? But the way that I think about JDM research, judgment decision-making research, is that research is either there to evaluate the quality of the judgment, right? So when you're coming up with your ideas next week, you can think of that. Maybe I want to know how investors make the decisions they make in a certain arena. Or maybe I want to know how management is using certain information to make decisions, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be in the auditing context, but I want to evaluate the quality of the decision itself. Okay? And then maybe the research idea that you come up with is to describe the judgment making process. Maybe you just want to explain how the decision is made in this particular area. Right? Or something that I like to do is kind of explore the factors that influence it. Right? So maybe it's a normal decision that you would that someone makes in your research area, but maybe you need to explore the fact that something else could be affecting that. Maybe they're motivated by unexpected bias, right? Like I was trying to be innovative and thinking that maybe the standard itself was given an unintentional bias by instigating a motivated goal. I thought that was pretty cool. It got me through my dissertation process. But there could be factors, right? Maybe, there could be instability in the market. Maybe there's instability in some sort of political arena. There could be all sort of influencing factors outside of audits. Understanding the cognitive processes that underlie the judgment or the decision-making process. So actually understanding more of the biases, right, that affect you on a cognitive level. I think we talked about it today about overload and processing, but there's only so much information that humans can process at any given time, right? So what does that mean? What does that mean for the decisions that your particular genre has to make, right? Again, we're talking about an area or an environment where no matter what subject we're talking about, there's going to be a lot of data, right? There's a lot of information. How do we make it useful? And how does your brain make it useful? And then, of course, there's always, after doing all those things, there's always tools that you can use to improve, right? How do you improve your judgments? How do you, back to an auditing context. So if auditors are prey to certain unconscious biases, and there are tons of them, right? Maybe I want to be efficient in my work, but the fact that I know that somebody did the same job last year in 4 hours, and I'm already approaching my 5th hour, that's going to affect the way that I audit, right? So if the standards are telling you, you need to audit in the most effective way possible, but you have this nagging voice in the back of your head knowing that the partner is going to be down your back trying to get you to explain why you did that, that's going to affect your judgment, right? How do you improve on something like that? What do you do? So there are always going to be tools to kind of or always going to be a need for tools to improve your judgments. Right? There's never going to be an optimal equation for predicting exactly how the stock market performs, right? Because it involves people, and people make their own decisions and their own judgments, right? Do you think of the market as an individual decision, or do you think of it as a group decision, right? So there's always going to be a need for understanding how things work, and then you have to be innovative in terms of ways to improve on that. Okay? So, where's my, oh, there it is. So going back to what you have to do for next week, okay? Using the 3 paragraphs in the Libby boxes. All right. And this presentation actually came from Bill Kenny. I was sitting next to him at lunch one day after he had presented, and he just gave it to everybody. Right? So you want to focus on what the specific problem it is that you're addressing in your research. Right? So you come up with this question, but you want to understand, if you are familiar with the KPMG framework, identifying the issue, the actual decision to be made, and not falling prey to kind of thinking about the symptoms, right? So you don't end up solving the wrong problem, right? So you want to think about what is the issue that you're addressing. What's the problem, right? And then you're going to express this conceptually. You're not going to think about it in terms of the actual operationalization of it just yet. The second piece you want to focus on is why. Why is this important? Does it matter? Does it have some sort of effect, right? You want to know why that specific problem is important to kind of motivate your research, And if you had done it, what would you find? But in this case, how would you address it? What do you plan to do to kind of figure out the answer to that question? For me, I build experiments, right? I want to test in different situations how different groups perform in certain scenarios. So that's kind of the essence of behavioral research. But let's go back to this one. We'll go back to the fact that, and we'll talk about this again next week as well, but in decision making in general, like we talked about in different genres, we're talking about people making decisions. We're talking about people involved in judgments, right? So there are going to be systematic traps that psychologically that people can fall prey to. So it doesn't have to specifically be in auditing or accounting or AIS or behavioral finance or corporate governance, right? It could be, it's the psychological principle sometimes, right? So when you're coming up with these ideas and trying to understand why it's important, maybe it's because we believe that people could be engaging in these heuristic thinking, right? And again, we'll talk about all those different biases, but there's so much research in it, specifically in AIS and auditing. I think my dissertation chair, one of his papers is on here, but not the one that he did about the anchoring effect and the halo, right? Sometimes when we make decisions, they influence other decisions we make, right? And when that happens, whether on a conscious or unconscious level, what does that mean for the judgments that are made subsequent to that? Right? So you might want to think about that in terms of the research that you perform. Right? Behavioral research is thinking about those particular relationships and those connections that are involved in making decisions, right? The different choices, and then involved in exercising judgment, discriminating against those alternatives. Helen also mentioned something about the difference between experts, right, and experience, or having expertise in experience, right? Sometimes being experienced helps you make better decisions, right? I have an expertise in that area. But sometimes being experienced makes you fall into these systematic traps, right? I'm overconfident. Or this happened in the past, so it's likely to happen in the future. Maybe it's not, right? We're supposed to be unbiased. Well, auditors are supposed to be unbiased and professionally skeptical when they go into a certain situation, an auditing situation. If I'm an expert, right, does going into these different auditing situations help me or hinder me? Some situations it wouldn't, some situations it would, right? Research, you can explore those. Or corporate governance, behavioral finance. There are a number of different there are a number of different ways you can go with your, here it is. Go with your research for next week. But you want to keep in mind some of the things that we talked about today, right? So when you're coming up with that question, really try to understand, I know you don't, if you choose to do auditing behavior, you don't have all of the literature, but some of the readings for today and then some of the suggested readings really give you a history of auditing behavioral research, right? So you definitely make sure you go back to that. And if you end up having a topic similar, that you're building on it, not just replicating it, right? Because it goes back to what we talked about in the beginning of class when we talked about uncertainties, right? Auditing in general involves estimates, involves uncertainties, and so does accounting. And business research in general, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have to go to school to be better at it, right? So, go back to the whole group thing. So we need 2, 4, 6. We need 3 groups of 2 and 1 of 1. There's a brave soul out there that's willing to come up with his or her research question by themselves. I know your names now, so can't really hide. What? Edward, you're volunteering? Are you gonna you do it? Okay. See, Randy's gonna do it. All right. Do you pretty much know or have an estimate of what you possibly would do for next week? It's okay if you don't. You think so? We have time. We can talk about it. Do you not have any questions? Does everybody know how to use Libby boxes? Yeah, I didn't think so. No. Edward, do you know what you're going to do? No? So the assignment is to develop a research idea, right? Write up no more than 2 pages using the Kinney 3-paragraph. Really, it's supposed to be 1. I'm just going to... Dr. Kinney presented a number of times. He would get on the people that actually had more than 2, but it's okay for the purposes of this class. You want to use some sort of behavioral theory, right? Or some sort of psychological theory, I should say. So no matter what it is that your topic is, you want to kind of think about, like I said, use what we talked about today as a frame of reference. Understand you don't have to do it in an auditing context, right? But do put some thought into it, because these potential ideas can become research questions for you, right? You spawn an idea, it becomes a paper that's publishable, you definitely will be published. Or if you are interested in behavioral research, like Dr. Brown-Bird and myself, like you could potentially have people you could work on projects with as well. So don't kind of think of this particular opportunity lightly. Actually give it some thought, or something that you're interested in, right? That can be developed, because when we talk about it in this context, we're the best audience you could have, or captivator, right? We're here to help you and assist you to making that idea interesting and giving a contribution. Were you going to say that? Were you going to say something? Sorry, I thought you were raising your hand. Does anyone have any questions over something we already went over?
So the behavior research of accounting or auditing, the method is use experiment?
Is all behavioral research experimental? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, but I mean, some other methods.
Yes, there are other methods.
Yeah, but for accounting, in the behavior accounting,
Yeah.
auditing. So the experiment
yes,
is
and yes. No, actually. Remember, behavioral research is really just understanding. That's a really good question. Behavioral research is really just understanding behavior. You can explore that in different methods, right? There's empirical research, there's analytical. We just happen to do experiments. I think Helen does other methods as well. It's harder to explain the why with archival research, but that's because I'm biased. So I don't do archival research. But no, it just so happens we develop experiments to test different theories. But no, you don't have to. There's a research out there that just does field studies, like grounded theory research that just kind of is observation and kind of building up theories based on actual field work being out in the practice. There's different ways that you can explore behavioral research. So no, it's not limited by just doing experiments, which is something you can keep in mind, obviously, when you do this particular project, because the way that you do that third part of the Kinney 3 paragraphs can be different. Not everybody does behavioral research the way that we do it. So no, that was a very good question. Different ways to explore that. my corporate governance group. For sure you guys would be like, yes. What does all of this mean? Okay. Selena, are you ready? Do you have a topic for next week? Not yet.
Still thinking.
You needed today to become inspired. I understand. I'm the same way.